One quiet moment, one gentle pull, and suddenly, everything else faded, leaving only her and me. It started with nothing more than a glance. I remember that morning clearly, though I couldn't have said why it lingered in my mind so vividly. The cafe was quiet, the kind of early-hour place where the clink of cups and the low hum of conversation felt almost like a gentle rhythm under your skin. I was waiting in line for my usual black coffee, no sugar, my mind preoccupied with the day ahead. And then she appeared. She moved with a quiet confidence, the kind that makes you notice without her ever trying. Her hair caught the sunlight as she passed the window, a soft chestnut wave that framed her face perfectly. There was something effortless about the way she held herself, shoulders relaxed, back straight, yet at the same time approachable, like she existed in her own space, unhurried, fully present. Our eyes met briefly as she reached the counter. There was no dramatic spark, no exaggerated cinematic moment. Just a simple, fleeting look, hers calm and observant, mine caught off guard. I felt my pulse quicken, a strange mix of curiosity and nervous awareness tightening in my chest. It wasn't just her appearance. It was the aura she carried, calm, warm, unassuming, yet quietly magnetic. I noticed small details, the things people normally overlook. The way her fingers brushed the menu as she decided her order, deliberate and unhurried. The faint scent of her perfume, subtle and floral, that hung just long enough to brush past me and linger in the air. The slight tilt of her head as she smiled at the barista, soft but genuine, a moment that made the world feel a little warmer. I found myself observing, almost unconsciously, the grace in her movements, how she leaned slightly as she read a sign, how her shoes tapped lightly against the floor as she walked, a rhythm I wanted to follow. And though she said nothing to me, spoke no words, the way she existed in that space spoke volumes. It was a quiet invitation I didn't quite know how to accept, yet I wanted to. The rest of the line moved on, but I stayed rooted, caught in that first fragile thread of connection. My mind replayed the briefest exchange of glances over and over, trying to make sense of the unfamiliar pull I felt. There was intrigue, certainly, but also a strange sense of comfort, as if her presence had brushed away a layer of the day's weight I hadn't realized I was carrying. When she finally walked away, coffee in hand, I felt a subtle ache, the kind that lingers not because of loss, but because something unexpected had touched you gently and made you aware of a new possibility. I didn't know her name. I didn't know anything about her. But I knew, somehow, that I would remember this first glance for a long time. The quiet, unassuming start of something that would grow far deeper than a morning encounter ever should. It was a few days after that first glance, and I hadn't expected to see her again so soon. I was walking through the small, quiet bookstore near my apartment, scanning the shelves for a book I'd been meaning to read, when I turned a corner and froze. There she was, standing in the poetry section, reaching for a worn paperback. The sight of her made my chest tighten in that same strange, anticipatory way it had before, a gentle, persistent pull I couldn't ignore. She looked up, and our eyes met once more. This time, the glance lasted a fraction longer, enough for a smile to flicker across her face. It was subtle, almost shy, yet it carried warmth. I felt a small, unexpected thrill at the recognition in her eyes, as though she remembered me too. My mind scrambled for words, for some casual way to acknowledge her presence, but all I could do was nod slightly, hoping it didn't look awkward. She stepped closer to browse the books, and by chance, our hands brushed as we both reached for the same volume. The contact was fleeting, barely more than a touch, yet was enough to send a quiet shiver up my arm. Her fingers lingered for just a heartbeat against mine, warm and deliberate, before retreating, and I felt the echo of that moment long after our hands parted. We exchanged a few words, light, polite conversation about the book, about the author, nothing extraordinary, but everything about it felt extraordinary. Her voice was calm, slightly husky, with the kind of softness that makes you want to lean in and listen more closely. I caught myself noticing how her smile creased the corners of her eyes, the subtle tilt of her head as she laughed at a small joke I had made, and the warmth in the tone that made my chest feel lighter, almost buoyant. At some point, we found ourselves standing side by side, shoulders brushing lightly as we scanned the shelves. There was a comfortable silence between us, punctuated by the faint rustle of pages and the soft hum of the air conditioner. I became acutely aware of her presence, the warmth radiating from her body, the subtle scent that clung to her, the rhythm of her breathing that seemed to echo alongside mine. I caught myself stealing glances at the way her hair fell softly over her shoulders, how she tucked a stray strand behind her ear without even realizing I was watching. When she finally walked toward the counter to purchase her book, I felt a small, inexplicable reluctance to let her leave. But even as she moved away, there was a quiet acknowledgement in her glance, a shared understanding that this accidental encounter wasn't entirely accidental. My pulse still thrummed in my chest long after she disappeared from view, and I realized that something in me had shifted quietly but irrevocably. That brief, accidental meeting had left a mark. It wasn't the kind of dramatic, movie-style moment that screams of romance. It was quieter, slower, more insistent in its subtlety. And I knew, with a certainty that both thrilled and unnerved me, that I wanted to see her again, to feel that warmth, that gentle touch, that quiet presence that seemed to pull at something deep inside me. It was one of those unexpected afternoons where time seemed to stretch just long enough to allow small miracles to happen. I hadn't planned to see her again, yet there she was, sitting alone on a bench in the park with a book in her hands, the late afternoon sun painting her hair in shades of gold. My steps slowed without my permission, heart already aware of the subtle pull she had on me. "Mind if I sit?" I asked, though it felt almost unnecessary. There was space, yet somehow it felt wrong to pass by without acknowledgement. She looked up, and that soft smile again, quiet and knowing, greeted me. She nodded, and I lowered myself onto the bench beside her, careful to give space, yet drawn closer by an invisible gravity. We didn't speak at first, letting the silence stretch comfortably between us. She turned the page of her book, the paper whispering softly, and I found myself stealing glances, noticing the faint crease in her brow when she was absorbed, the small curve of her lips when she read something amusing. Time slowed. Every small movement, every subtle gesture seemed amplified. A laugh, a glance, a tilt of her head. Eventually, conversation found its way into the space between us. We talked about the book, yes, but also about the little things, the music we liked, places we wanted to see, the kind of moments that make life feel larger than it really is. Her voice had a rhythm that drew me in, warm and steady, carrying a quiet confidence softened by vulnerability. There was an ease between us I hadn't expected, a shared comfort that didn't need grand gestures to be meaningful. At one point, our knees brushed lightly as we shifted on the bench. It was accidental, yet electric. The warmth of her leg against mine sent a shiver through my chest. Her hand moved subtly, brushing against mine as she reached for her bag, and my fingers twitched as if seeking to hold the fleeting contact just a moment longer. She didn't notice, or perhaps she did, and let it linger intentionally. Either way, the moment passed too quickly, leaving a soft echo of awareness between us. I noticed how her presence changed the world around me. The breeze seemed softer, carrying the faint scent of flowers mingled with the subtle perfume she wore. The sounds of the park, children laughing, leaves rustling, felt like a backdrop to a private, delicate connection. Even the sunlight, spilling across her face, highlighted the warmth in her skin and the quiet vulnerability in her eyes. By the time we stood to leave, neither of us spoke of the fleeting intimacy we had shared. Words felt unnecessary. The small gestures, the lingering glances, the gentle touches spoke louder than any sentence could. As I walked away, I realized with startling clarity that our connection was no longer just curiosity. Something had shifted quietly but irrevocably. We had shared a moment, delicate, ordinary, yet extraordinary in its quiet intensity. And in that shared moment, I understood that the pull I had felt from the very first glance wasn't fading. It was growing, slow and steady, drawing me closer in ways I hadn't yet dared to name, and I suspected she felt it too. After that afternoon on the park bench, I found myself thinking about her constantly, replaying every small detail: the tilt of her head, the warmth in her smile, the way her hand had brushed against mine ever so lightly. And yet, alongside that quiet anticipation, there was a gnawing hesitation I couldn't ignore. The age difference between us had become impossible to overlook, and suddenly every thought of her carried a weight of self-consciousness and doubt. I noticed it in the way I avoided certain places, in the careful timing of my days, as if keeping a safe distance would help me sort out my feelings. But no matter what I did, there she was in my mind, in the small moments of my day, in the memory of her quiet presence. And when I saw her again, whether across a room or in a crowded cafe, that hesitation sharpened. I could feel my chest tighten, my palms grow slightly clammy, my mind racing with questions I didn't know how to answer. Is this appropriate? Does she even feel the same? Her behavior offered no answers, only subtle signals that deepened the tension. A lingering glance across a room, a hand brushing past mine when reaching for something, the soft inflection in her voice when she spoke to me. Each moment was delicate, almost imperceptible, yet stirred something deep inside me. The proximity of her warmth, the quiet attentiveness in her eyes, made my hesitation both unbearable and irresistible. I spent hours analyzing the nuances of our interactions. When she smiled at me in passing, was it friendliness or something more? When she laughed at a casual joke, was her warmth directed at me, or was I projecting my desire onto her? I became acutely aware of the way my own body reacted around her, the subtle quickening of my pulse, the slight tension in my shoulders, the way my gaze would inevitably follow her even when I tried not to look. And yet, beneath all the doubt, there was a thrill I couldn't deny. The idea of being near her, of sharing even a small moment of her attention, created a quiet ache that felt both dangerous and intoxicating. I longed to close the distance between us, to feel her presence fully, to allow myself to experience the warmth and comfort she seemed to offer effortlessly. In moments of solitude, I confronted the conflict head-on. I reminded myself of societal expectations, the careful considerations of propriety, the whisper of judgment that lingered in the back of my mind. But no rational argument could suppress the pull I felt, that subtle gravitational force drawing me closer, insisting I notice her, cherish her, and hope, against all hesitation, that she might feel the same. By the end of the day, the conflict remained unresolved, a tension suspended in the air between longing and restraint. But for the first time, I began to recognize it not as a barrier, but as the quiet electric hum of something real, something worth navigating carefully, slowly, and wholeheartedly. And in that suspended moment, I realized that hesitation was not the end of the story. It was merely the prelude to a connection that would demand patience, awareness, and courage. A connection that, despite my doubts, I could no longer ignore. It was an ordinary evening, the kind that felt like it could slip past unnoticed if you weren't paying attention. I had just stepped out of the office, carrying the weight of a long day, when I saw her waiting at the small coffee shop near the corner of the street. My chest tightened instantly, that familiar pull returning like an old, persistent tide. She looked up as I approached, and that subtle, knowing smile greeted me, the one that always made my pulse accelerate without a word being spoken. We greeted each other casually, our conversation light, drifting from the mundane, work, the weather, the street lights flickering to life, to small, personal reflections. But beneath the words, there was a quiet energy, a current that neither of us tried to name yet, and I felt it coil around my chest in a way that made my breath a little shallower. At one point, as I reached for the sugar packets, she stepped closer, not in an obvious, deliberate way, but in a movement so natural it almost seemed accidental. Her hand brushed against my arm lightly, a fleeting contact that felt deliberate enough to make my stomach flutter. I froze, aware of the warmth of her skin and the subtle pressure of her touch. There was no need for words. The gesture itself spoke volumes. Then it happened. Without warning, she leaned slightly toward me, close enough that I could feel the quiet steadiness of her heartbeat through her chest. Her shoulder brushed mine ever so gently, and in that moment, it felt as though the rest of the world had receded. The hum of traffic, the chatter of passers-by, even the flicker of streetlights became background to the warmth radiating between us. I could feel the faint scent of her perfume, delicate and calming, intertwining with the soft exhale she let slip as she adjusted the collar of her coat. It lasted only a heartbeat, a fleeting moment, but it lingered in my memory far longer. I could feel the unspoken message in her closeness, the quiet assurance, the gentle acknowledgement of something that had been simmering between us for weeks. My fingers itched to respond, to let my hand brush hers, but I held back, savoring the electric tension of restraint. We both stepped back slightly, smiling at each other. No words necessary, only the mutual recognition of the intimacy we had just shared. The simple gesture left me awash in warmth and wonder, a mix of comfort and longing that made my pulse race and my thoughts stumble. It was a small, quiet act, but it carried everything. The vulnerability, the curiosity, the growing desire to be near her, and the unspoken invitation to take the next step. As I walked home that night, I replayed the moment endlessly. The memory of her warmth, the softness of her shoulder against mine, the faint scent that lingered. It all stayed with me like a secret I wasn't ready to share. That quiet gesture had changed everything. It was subtle, gentle, and perfectly timed, yet it left no doubt in my mind. The connection between us was real, intimate, and slowly, deliberately pulling us closer towards something neither of us dared to name aloud just yet. The evening air was cooler than I expected, carrying the faint scent of rain and earth, and I found myself walking toward the small park where we had shared our first extended conversation. She was already there, sitting on the familiar bench, a book resting in her lap, but her attention entirely on me the moment I arrived. Her eyes, soft and steady, held an openness that made my chest tighten in anticipation. We greeted each other with that same quiet familiarity, a smile, a nod, a small brush of hands as I lowered myself beside her. The world felt slower here, smaller, contained within the warmth that radiated from her presence. We spoke casually at first, about the book she was reading, about the fleeting drizzle earlier, about nothing that seemed particularly important. Yet everything mattered. And then, as if drawn by some unspoken current, the conversation shifted. Words I had rehearsed in my mind for days rose to the surface, trembling, unsure. I've been thinking about you. I began, my voice quieter than I intended, almost blending with the rustle of leaves. She turned toward me, her gaze patient, inviting. I swallowed, the vulnerability in the admission frightening and exhilarating all at once. More than I expected. Actually, I like being around you. She didn't move away. Instead, her hand found mine, fingers intertwining in a gentle, unhurried clasp that sent warmth up my arm and through my chest. Her thumb traced soft circles on the back of my hand, steady and comforting. Her eyes searched mine, and in that quiet scrutiny, I felt both exposed and accepted. "I'm glad you said that," she murmured, her voice low and calm, but carrying a tremor of something deeper, relief, perhaps, or recognition. I felt the same. I wasn't sure how to say it, or if it was even appropriate, but I wanted you to know. Her fingers tightened slightly, just enough to make the contact undeniable. In that moment, the world contracted until it existed only between us. The warmth of her hand against mine, the subtle rise and fall of her chest, the steady cadence of her breathing. I leaned slightly closer, careful not to rush, letting the proximity speak in place of words. Her shoulder brushed mine ever so lightly, and the quiet steadiness of her presence grounded me, dispelling all the hesitation that had haunted me for weeks. We didn't need to say more. The confession wasn't a grand declaration, but a soft acknowledgement, a promise that was both tentative and profound. I could feel the weight of mutual understanding, the careful acceptance of what we were beginning to explore together. It wasn't about the future yet. It was about this moment, raw and fragile, yet full of warmth and quiet reassurance. As the evening deepened and the first stars appeared in the sky, we remained there, hand in hand, side by side. The confession had broken a barrier, yes, but it also built something new, a shared space of trust, of closeness, of unspoken affection. And in that silence, in that gentle touch and lingering gaze, I realized that this slow, deliberate connection, filled with hesitation, curiosity, and now mutual acknowledgement, was becoming the most significant part of my life. The evening had settled into a quiet calm, the kind that feels both intimate and infinite. I found myself walking toward the same park where so much of our slow, careful connection had grown. She was already there, seated on the familiar bench, the fading sunlight catching the subtle highlights in her hair. She looked up as I approached, and that soft, knowing smile, gentle, unassuming, yet magnetic, greeted me. My chest tightened, but this time it was different, steady, warm, and welcoming rather than anxious. We exchanged the usual casual greetings, our hands brushing lightly as we settled beside each other. There was no rush, no need to speak immediately. Instead, we let the silence stretch, comfortable and full, each of us aware of the other in a way that felt natural, unforced. Her presence radiated warmth, a steady, quiet heartbeat against my own, and I realized how much I've been craving this. Not just the touch, but the calm, attentive intimacy of simply being near her. As the sky shifted to twilight, she leaned closer, her shoulder pressing gently against mine. I felt the familiar warmth of her body, and with it, the subtle reassurance that everything we had been navigating, hesitation, doubt, unspoken desire, had led to this moment. My fingers brushed hers, this time intentionally intertwining with ease. The world around us seemed to melt away. The distant sounds of traffic, the rustle of leaves, even the fading glow of streetlights faded into the background, leaving only her, only us. She tilted her head slightly, resting her cheek briefly against my shoulder. The softness of her skin, the quiet steadiness of her breathing, and the gentle exhale she released felt like a silent acknowledgement of all that had passed between us. No words were necessary. The physical closeness, the subtle warmth of touch, spoke volumes. I could feel her hand tighten around mine just slightly, a small gesture that conveyed affection, trust, and the quiet promise of shared intimacy. We stayed that way for what felt like hours, though it was likely only minutes. We spoke occasionally in soft, measured tones, memories of small moments, shared laughter, and gentle confessions. Each word, each glance, each brush of skin was infused with the depth of connection we had slowly nurtured. The age difference that had once felt like a looming obstacle now seemed irrelevant, softened by the mutual respect, understanding, and emotional honesty that had brought us here. When we finally rose to leave, we walked side by side, fingers brushing, shoulders occasionally touching. The warmth lingered long after the physical contact ended, echoing in the subtle smiles and glances we exchanged. That quiet moment, the gentle pull, the subtle closeness, the shared acknowledgement of our feelings, had evolved into something enduring, a bond built on patience, vulnerability, and an appreciation for the slow, deliberate pace at which love had unfolded between us. As I walked home that night, I carried with me the memory of her warmth, the gentle rhythm of our shared presence, and the understanding that this was only the beginning. The connection we had forged, delicate yet profound, was no longer a fleeting pull or hesitant glance. It was real, it was mutual, and it was ours, a quiet, enduring love that had bloomed from patience, attentiveness, and the courage to let two hearts meet gently, fully, and completely.